There's a building in London that history has, so far, failed to destroy. 41 to 42 Cloth Fair, Smithfield, built at the turn of the 17th century when Shakespeare was still writing plays. Behind its later Georgian facade hides a timber frame from around 1600. 4 stories rise to a tiled roof with a distinctive gable, and if you look up at the first and second floors, you'll see something remarkable. Pairs of 2-story timber bay windows, their lead-framed glass etched with the signatures of some of the house's notable guests. Winston Churchill and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, said to be among them. The building sits in a narrow street that curves around the church of St. Bartholomew the Great, one of London's oldest parish churches. Standing in the street, you can get a feel for what saved these houses. Because on the night of September 1st, 1666, just under a mile away from this spot, a young baker's apprentice named Thomas Dagger woke up choking. Smoke was pouring under his bedroom door. Downstairs, in the bakehouse of Thomas Farriner on Pudding Lane, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Within 4 days, 4/5 of the area of the City of London would be ash. 13,000 houses, 87 churches, St. Paul's Cathedral itself, its lead roof melting and pouring down the streets like a river. And yet this ordinary house survived. Not because anyone saved it, but because the fire stopped, seemingly arbitrarily, about 200 metres away from Cloth Fair at a spot called Pye Corner, marked today by a chubby golden statue of a boy known as the Golden Boy of Pye Corner. This video is about those survivals, arbitrary or otherwise, about the streets and lanes that escaped the fire through a combination of wind, gunpowder and bureaucratic paralysis, and about how this city preserved the past not through grand design, but through sheer inconvenience. Thomas Farriner wasn't just any baker. He held the lucrative contract to supply ship's biscuits to the Royal Navy, hardtack that could survive months at sea without rotting. His bakehouse sat on Pudding Lane, at the spot marked by a small plaque in the now widened road. The street gets its name from the butchers' houses that once stood there, and being the route used to transport offal to the Thames. Pudding is a medieval English word meaning entrails. The household that night consisted of Farriner himself, about 50 years old and recently widowed, his adult son Thomas Jr., his daughter Hannah, Thomas Dagger, and a maid whose name we'll probably never know. Farriner insisted later that he'd checked the ovens himself that night. Everything had been properly dampened down. No embers, no danger. He was wrong. Sometime around 1 in the morning, Dagger woke to what was later described as the choke of the smoke. Fire had started somewhere in the bakehouse. He alerted the household. They climbed to an upper window. Farriner, his son, and Dagger escaped by crawling along a gutter to a neighbouring building. Hannah followed, badly burned. The maid, terrified of the height, refused to jump. She likely became the first victim of the Great Fire of London as the house collapsed around her. At this point, had anyone acted decisively, London might have been saved. The standard firefighting technique of the era involved creating fire breaks, pulling down houses adjacent to the blaze so the flames had nothing to feed on. But the occupants protested, and destroying private property without the owner's consent would require authorization from the Lord Mayor himself. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, a wine and timber merchant known more for socializing than any leadership abilities, was roused from his bed around 3 in the morning. He arrived on the scene to survey the fire. Most properties in London at the time were rented, and the owners of the shops and houses on Pudding Lane could have been anywhere. Without their permission, Bloodworth dared not order the building's destruction. According to Samuel Pepys, who chronicled the disaster in his diary, Bloodworth dismissed it completely. He refused to authorize demolitions and went home to bed. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. By the time he recognized the danger, it was far too late. No fire breaks were created, and the easterly wind, the same wind that had been blowing for weeks through a hot, dry summer, began to do its work. Fires were common throughout London's medieval history, although none had caused such far-reaching devastation since the early 13th century. There was no fire brigade, but a well-established convention that members of the public, armed with buckets, would spring into action when the church bells sounded. Some parishes owned fire engines, but these were primitive, heavy machines that required dozens of men just to move through London's streets. Those that managed to reach Pudding Lane proved almost useless against an inferno of this scale. They either couldn't get close enough to the fire, or couldn't access the water supply, as the water wheels under London Bridge that pumped water from the Thames into the city were themselves on fire. London into the Stuart period was a city built to burn. Timber frames, overhanging stories, streets so narrow that neighbours could lean out of upper windows and shake hands across the alley, warehouses packed with combustible goods, concentrated along the Thames waterfront where Pudding Lane met the river. The wind turned those narrow lanes into blast furnaces. By Monday the fire had reached London Bridge and spread along the houses that stood on it. Southwark, south of the Thames, was now under threat, and was spared only due to a single gap in the buildings on the bridge, itself caused by an earlier fire. By Monday evening it was consuming Cheapside, the commercial heart of the city. On Tuesday it reached St. Paul's Cathedral. The medieval building, 500 years old, its lead roof covering acre upon acre, stood directly in the fire's path. It didn't stand for long. The lead melted at around 327 degrees Celsius. Witnesses described it pouring down the streets in molten rivers, causing the pavements to glow red. The cathedral's stone walls cracked and exploded in the heat. The wooden interior, pews, roof timbers, as well as the stock of many London booksellers, which had been stored in the crypt of St. Paul's for safety from the fire, all vanished into smoke. Samuel Pepys watched the events unfold from a tavern on the southern bank of the Thames, on what is believed to be the site where the Anchor pub now stands. "We saw the fire grow," he wrote, "and, as it grew darker, appeared more and more, and in corners and upon steeples, and between churches and houses, as far as we could see up the hill of the city, in a most horrid, bloody flame." King Charles II, unhappy with the Lord Mayor's handling of the disaster, had been personally directing the firefighting efforts, and placed his brother, the Duke of York, later to become King James II, in charge. He ordered the widespread use of gunpowder to demolish buildings and create fire breaks. The fire didn't burn evenly. It jumped here, stalled there, curved around certain streets while consuming everything in the next, its edges determined by wind direction, by stone walls, by the desperate deployment of gunpowder. And in those irregular edges, in those accidents of wind and stone, certain places survived. The Church of St. Bartholomew the Great is one of London's oldest churches, founded in 1123 as part of an Augustinian priory. By the time of the Great Fire, the priory was long dissolved. Henry VIII had seen to that, but its massive medieval stone walls remained. It sat near the edge of the fire's advance. The flames came close by, but the church itself survived, with the priory precinct acting as a firebreak before the flames could reach it. Immediately to the south lay St. Bartholomew's Hospital, also founded in 1123. As the fire approached, buildings in the surrounding streets were pulled down in desperate attempts to create fire breaks. Whether by deliberate planning or hurried necessity, the hospital was spared. Behind the church precinct, and the hospital beyond it, Cloth Fair lay just out of reach. In the days that followed, Smithfield became a place of refuge. The open fields filled with the displaced. The hospital treated the injured. And amid the smoking ruins of the city, this small pocket of medieval London, church, hospital, lane, and house, remained standing. Further to the east, the Tower of London should have been safe. The prevailing easterly wind was blowing the flames westward, away from the fortress. But the heat became so intense that buildings began igniting even in the direction of the tower, and heading straight towards its stores of the Royal Navy's gunpowder. The garrison didn't wait for permission. They used gunpowder with ruthless efficiency, demolishing houses around the tower to create fire breaks before the flames could reach them. Around 11 p.m. on Tuesday evening, the wind that had driven the flames for days finally dropped. Deprived of its momentum, the fire began to exhaust itself. The combination of weakening wind and explosive fire breaks created a jagged boundary of survival. Churches like St. Helen's Bishopsgate, a beautiful medieval church that still stands today, escaped because they sat just on the right side of that invisible line. But even in areas that did burn, the street pattern often survived intact. Not the buildings, but the streets themselves. Walk through the city today and you'll find that many lanes follow exactly the same routes they did in 1300. The buildings are modern, the pavements are Victorian, the street furniture is 20th century, but the alignments, the fundamental geometry of the city, are medieval. The reason lies primarily in property law. Every inch of the city belonged to someone. Every boundary was recorded. Every landlord had rights. And when the flames died and the smoke cleared, those landlords weren't about to surrender their property to some grand urban redesign, no matter how rational it might seem. In the weeks after the fire, London's greatest minds proposed magnificent visions for a new city. Christopher Wren, who would take charge of rebuilding London's churches, was at this point more an enthusiastic amateur than the renowned architect we know today. He drew up plans for a grid of wide boulevards radiating from piazzas, the grandeur of Rome reborn on the Thames. John Evelyn, the diarist and garden designer, proposed a similar scheme: straight streets, orderly blocks, rational proportions, a Renaissance city rising from medieval ashes. Others submitted a number of other designs. Richard Newcourt proposed a street layout of rectangular blocks. Valentine Knight's plan included a new barge canal, an idea which saw him arrested and imprisoned by an outraged Charles II at the suggestion that the king might personally, and perhaps corruptly, profit from it. Charles was most enthusiastic about Wren's proposal, but Parliament was split, and also had reservations about any fundamental redesign of the city. The problem was compensation. All of the plans required completely redrawing property boundaries. Some plots of land would shrink or disappear altogether. Landlords who'd owned a narrow house on a winding lane might find themselves allocated a different plot entirely, perhaps smaller, perhaps less commercially valuable, perhaps in a different area altogether. And who would pay the difference? The Second Anglo-Dutch War had drained the treasury. The City of London itself was already in debt. Parliament passed rebuilding acts in 1667 and 1670, establishing minimum standards like brick or stone construction. Brick and stone wasn't a new requirement. It was mandated in several proclamations by James I as early as 1605, partly because the timber was badly needed to build ships for the navy. Other provisions included a ban on overhanging stories that allowed flames to jump across alleys and lanes to other buildings, and a requirement for party walls between buildings that limited the spread of fire between neighbouring properties. Around 150 important streets were to be widened, and no buildings were to be constructed within 40 feet of the Thames. But the Acts also explicitly protected the property boundaries of landowners. But the rights of tenants, who made up the majority of Londoners, were more complicated. It was common for leases of the time to place the onus for maintenance and good repair on the tenants, not the landlords. The upshot of this was that tenants were now contractually responsible for rebuilding their houses at their own expense. Some unscrupulous landlords took advantage of this, evicting tenants just months after they had rebuilt their homes in order to put them on the market at a higher rental price. Fire courts were set up in order to settle disputes between such landlords and tenants, often favouring the tenants and helping to negotiate long extended leases or rent reductions if they intended to rebuild quickly. Where the tenants were unable to rebuild, the courts oversaw the termination of the leases so that landlords could release the land to new tenants who could. Where streets were to be widened, property owners were to be compensated for loss of land to accommodate them. But wholesale changes to the street layouts of London would have required untangling the property rights of most of London's landowners, which could have taken years, and the compensation for loss of land would have been prohibitively expensive for both the Crown and City. The result was that the grand designs of Wren, Evelyn and others were abandoned. Instead, London rebuilt quickly, and rebuilt largely on its old footprint. Many of London's streets, lanes and alleys survived. Over the centuries, these lanes became entrenched. Warehouses bulged over them. Victorian offices bridged above them. 20th century developers built around them. Modern fire regulations grudgingly accommodated them. The city grew upward and outward, but the medieval street pattern remained fixed, not preserved deliberately, but simply too expensive and complicated to change. But the house in Cloth Fair almost didn't make it to the 21st century. By 1913, the once prosperous medieval street had degenerated into slums. The houses were overcrowded, disease-ridden, structurally unsound. Local authorities drew up demolition plans. Two architects, Paul Paget and John Seeley, bought the buildings and began restoring them, not as museums, but as homes. After World War II, the poet John Betjeman, who would become England's poet laureate and its most famous advocate for architectural preservation, moved into number 43 next door. He lived there from 1954 to 1973, launching many of his campaigns to save threatened buildings from this medieval house that had itself nearly been destroyed. So what do these surviving alleys tell us? Mainly that London's medieval street pattern endured not through any grand preservation effort, but through simple economics and legal complexity. The buildings survived the Great Fire because they happened to exist in the right conditions. Stone walls here, wind direction there, fire breaks in the right places. The alley survived the reconstruction because property law made it cheaper to rebuild on the old lines than negotiate new boundaries. And they've survived every century since, even amid the rubble of the Blitz, because the same forces still applied. Property boundaries remained. Compensation still had to be negotiated. Businesses needed to reopen quickly. It was simpler to leave them alone. The real survivors of 1666 aren't the timber frames or the stone walls. They're the property lines, the medieval geometry, the narrow lanes that wind between modern offices because no one could ever quite agree on how to straighten them out. Not preserved, not protected, just never quite worth the effort.